Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is our April 2024 Scholars Library series. Some of you will have been here before, and you'll know that each month this initiative allows a Rhodes alum to come and talk about their literary works to those directly in the Rhodes community and also those beyond it. We now excitingly have a dedicated webpage for all past and upcoming events in the series, so I'm going to pop the link in the chat for you to see, and you can see what's coming up next and watch recordings of any that you've missed. But thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to welcome Jonathan Shapiro to talk about his book, How to Be Abe Lincoln, 7 Steps Towards Leading a Legendary Life. He's holding it right there. And fellow scholar Lucas is here to moderate the conversation today. He is a DPhil candidate and examination fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and his current research is on China and international organisations in the mid-20th century. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Lucas, who'll give you a further introduction to Jonathan and the session, and we can get right into it. Have a think and post any questions you might have in the Q&A as we go, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. And I'll also put a link so you can find out more about Jonathan's book in the chat. But over to you, Lucas.
Thanks a lot, Georgie. So yeah, it's a big pleasure to be here today and talking with Jonathan. We met briefly last week over Zoom, and I'm very excited to continue the conversation today. So let me first introduce Jonathan to the audience. So Jonathan came to Oxford all the way back in 1985 now. So he's got a lot of experience to kind of share with us, and I'm gonna kind of introduce you to some of the very kind of varied things he's done in his life. So after Oxford, he received his law degree from Berkeley and became a lawyer, including a decade trying cases as a federal prosecutor. But for the past 24 years now, I believe, he has been writing and producing TV, as well as actually a number of other formats of storytelling. So especially iconic legal dramas, such as Goliath, which I was really enjoying last night. And I've got a question or two about that.
Excellent.
He's received the Emmy, Peabody, Humanitas, and American Film Institute Awards. And in 2018, he also wrote his first play, which has had 7 sold-out runs. Congratulations on that, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And this is his 3rd book. If you are interested in his other books, hopefully Georgie could pop some information in the chat. But we're here today to talk about the 3rd book, which is titled How to Be Abe Lincoln. So what we'll do today is I'll kick off, and looking forward to having a nice chat with Jonathan about the book. I've got some questions, and we'll have some back and forth, but please do think about what questions interest you, either from Jonathan's background or about Lincoln or about anything we're saying, because what we'd love to do is open up the conversation. But to start things off, it's my pleasure to kind of kick off with some questions. So Jonathan, I mean, let's kind of take it all the way back to the kind of genesis of the book. I mean, I would love to know more about that, because as you don't shy away from pointing out, there have been tens of thousands of books on Abe Lincoln, and Lincoln has meant lots of things, lots of people. But what about you? I mean, kind of, how did the idea for this book come into your life? Was it one moment of inspiration? Was it a decades-long gestation? The story there.
It's funny you say gestation, Lucas, because when we talked last week, you mentioned that your wife and you are expecting your first child. So clearly that subject is on your mind, and I can understand that as the father of 3 myself. It's a lifelong obsession that I have with Lincoln. I grew up in what we call the old country in California, which is Woodland Hills in the San Fernando Valley. And I am surely not the only young American child who mistakenly believed Abraham Lincoln was our only Jewish president. Both of my grandfathers are named Abraham. albeit for a different Abraham, but I didn't realize that at the time. And the beard kind of threw me. And he was sad. So those three things convinced me that he was Jewish. But apparently he wasn't. That's one of the things I point out in my book. But I've always been an admirer of Lincoln. As a trial lawyer myself, I related to his legal practice and his legal mind, I suppose. And as someone who's always loved storytelling and humor, he was our first president to use humor as a form of persuasion and advocacy. And I loved Lincoln because he dealt with dark times, with depression, with many obstacles, with great humor and grace. Our oldest son is named Abraham. Don't tell our rabbi it isn't for the Abrahamic forefather, it's for Abraham Lincoln. And I think he's the greatest American who has ever lived. And so when my publisher said, what would you like to write your third book about? I thought, well, I'd like to write my version of Lincoln, knowing that there are over 60,000 volumes written about him. I wanted to say something unique, and that was the goal.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I think it's interesting to I read some of the chapters before our brief chat last week, and then some of them afterwards. And as I was reading some of the chapters in the past few days, I was thinking about the timing in your life of kind of this book, and but let me phrase it in this way, because I mean, this is a question I was thinking about towards the end of your book. But if I can drop that in right now, I mean, I was thinking about Lincoln's life happens in stages. And so does your life, and so does everyone else's life. So, I mean, how have you related, given how long your relationship to Abraham Lincoln has been? How in different stages have you related differently to his story, his life? I mean, it seems to start from when you were a child, a teenager, through your time in Oxford and into your 30s and 40s. So, I don't want you to feel the pressure to tell us your whole life story, but how has that shaped both your understanding of Lincoln and how you chose to write this book?
Well, that's a great question and a very delicate way of mentioning that I'm old. In fact, in a few days, I'm going to turn 61, and don't I look great? Thank you. I would not have put money on it when I was a drinking man at Oxford, but nevertheless, I love that question because it implies what is true, which is I could not have possibly written this book before I was 60, 59, 60. Lincoln is the mountain in the distance that Americans look to for inspiration and for a sense of where we are as a people and as a culture. And personally, my relationship with Lincoln has changed, as you point out, and I talk about in the book that when I was a child, I experienced Lincoln through the John Ford film, Young Mr. Lincoln, and Henry Fonda's performance, which has become such an iconic Lincoln version. Going through graduate school in history at Harvard and at Oxford, where I obtained two completely irrelevant master's degrees, I might add. You cannot turn them into one PhD. I've tried. But I became suspicious of the Lincoln myth. I became, perhaps my Marxist historian advisors had something to do with it, but I began to question the veracity of the Lincoln myth. And anyone who studies Lincoln will discover that much of what we think of is true is not true. And much of what we think is the ipsissima verba is in fact made up later. And so I became suspicious of the hagiographical Lincoln. What changed wasn't Lincoln. What changed was becoming a father, becoming a husband. I became a husband first, father, although it doesn't have to be. We'll talk about that later. But the point is, my understanding, my empathy, my love of Lincoln increased as I became older and realized that what's better than the saintly Lincoln is the real Lincoln, warts and all. And what his greatness is based on is his commitment to self-improvement, his commitment to empathy, and something that his bodyguard, Rutherford, said, which was, if you want to understand Lincoln, you have to understand that he was driven exclusively by love. And as I've gotten older, this understanding of the power of love and Lincoln has sort of become a guiding principle.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. I mean, there are about 12 questions I want to ask based on what you just said, but let me just pick up on that last part on love, which, you know, I was thinking a lot, you know, in that chapter, which is I think maybe toward, not quite the end, but towards the end of the book, you have two different chapters. One is collaboration and one is love. And there's one passage that links them where you say, we need not love the people we collaborate with. And then you launch into a very interesting kind of discussion of his marriage and anyway, I mean, I won't repeat all the details here, but I just want to pick up about this point about love, since you emphasized that just now. So clearly Lincoln had to collaborate with all kinds of people he didn't like, and we all need to in life, and that's a point well taken. But there's this kind of adjacent thing of love. Why do you think that's really important for us to think about, kind of, I guess, publicly? Because, I mean, let's kind of assume it's really important privately, you know, that we have relationships of love with, you know, could be our partner, could be our children, could be our friends. But, you know, what is the public dimension of love that you think we would really miss if we didn't consider in the context of Lincoln's life or more broadly?
Well, I entered this topic with appropriate trepidation because, as you point out, love is a subject that is generally kept in the private sphere. And so the question that I try to ask in the book is there a place for love in the public sphere? And Leo Tolstoy, of all people, when asked in 1909 to discuss Lincoln, wrote the following: love is the foundation of Lincoln's life. This is what makes him immortal and gives him the quality of a giant. I hope that his centenary birthday will create an impulse toward righteousness among the nations. Lincoln lived and died a hero and as a great character. He will live as long as the world lives. So this notion of Tolstoy saying that Lincoln ought to be a light unto the nations, I take seriously. I take seriously this notion that in a time of unbelievable fractiousness in my country and in the dangerous world we live in a time of terrible war and suffering, hate gets the press. Hate is loud. Hate is dramatic. We start television shows with acts of hate and violence and seek to conclude them in love. And so what Lincoln tried to introduce notions of reconciliation with the South in the middle of the Civil War. And he was driven by a sense of love. So there was a very famous professor in the 70s when I was growing up at the University of Southern California named Leo Buscaglia. And he used to be on public television giving lectures about love, and we all used to make fun of it. I've come to realize at 60 something I didn't know when I was 28, which is love is our only hope as a species. But love is about righteousness. It's about what Tolstoy talked about. It's not about intimate relations. It's about love one feels for humanity and the responsibility one feels not only toward other people, but toward the future. To me, whether the issue is climate change, whether the issue is self-determination of peoples, whether the issue is immigration, whether the issue is the unfairness in the free market capitalist system, love needs to be at the table. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to achieve with the Lincoln book was to introduce into the marketplace of ideas that there's a role and there's a place for people like us, and people like us, the Rhodes Scholar community, to talk openly and proudly about the fact that we are advocates of love. And that's exactly the kind of statement that I would have made fun of as a young person.
No, I mean,
and yet it's what I believe now.
No, I mean, if I still count as a young person, I very
you do.
I very much am in sympathy with that. But if I could just follow up by trying to find that kind of connection, comparing and contrasting the chapter on collaboration and the chapter on love. I mean, let me turn this, I guess, let me ask you to turn it maybe towards your own life. I mean, obviously the book is about Lincoln, but it's also about our lives, our own lives. And, you know, I'm just curious, I mean, how do you think through in your life, in your decisions, where you really want to face a situation through the prism of love versus when you want to face a situation through the prism of, you know, collaboration, which sometimes even where love is, it just doesn't seem very plausible or possible. But you don't want to let that, I guess, take away from the possibility of achieving a collaboration. How do you think kind of through that?
Well, in terms of Lincoln, it's a myth that he was a self-made man. Lincoln, more than almost any other president, was made through his collaborations with others. And as I talk about in the book, he had a real gift for collaborating with difficult people. His law partner for 14 years, Billy Herndon, was an irritable alcoholic, hypocrite, without a sense of humor. And yet Lincoln worked with him for 14 years and shows us how to collaborate. He approached Billy Herndon as an equal with respect, despite the fact he disagreed with almost everything Herndon said and did. And he put those differences aside and made a conscientious effort to not engage in conversations that would lead into those areas that he knew would cause disputation. You know, if we learn nothing else from Lincoln as we live in the age of politics in America, that would be a great lesson. If you want to collaborate with somebody, never talk about politics. If you want to collaborate with somebody, never talk about religion. Right? The simple lessons that Lincoln taught us. If you want to really collaborate with someone, approach them as if they have valuable ideas that are always worth listening to. Actually take their side in an argument and walk in their shoes and find what it is that you can empathize with. In my life, and I say it in the book, and I'm not proud of it, in most collaborations, I was Billy Herndon. I was the irritable one. I was the drunk one. I was the one who would have fights, right? When I was a prosecutor, I was the only federal prosecutor, I think, in history who was held in contempt twice for treating my own witnesses hostile. I mean, life was nothing but nails and I had nothing but a hammer. And it took me a long time to realize that my father's advice that you get more with honey than the sting is true. And it's killingly hard to know that and to learn that when you're a lawyer, because that's an adversarial process. Marriage, my parents, who were married for 66 years, and my own marriage of 28 years, probably has taught me more than anything else that a great collaboration has love in it, but doesn't necessarily have to have it. I've collaborated for many, many years with one particular writer. In fact, my whole career, I've collaborated with David E. Kelley, and we've written 9 shows together. And we're capable of sitting at a lunch together where there's only he and not talk, period. This is what happens when you collaborate with someone from Maine. They're very, very taciturn. And David Kelly is married to Michelle Pfeiffer. He certainly doesn't need love from me. And I'm happily married to Betsy. The collaboration is based on the fact that how different our temperaments and speeds are, we're strong where the other one is weak. And we see the value of it. You know, the greatest example of this, of course, is I think the collaboration Lincoln had with Mary Todd Lincoln. Leave the love aside. They were political partners. When he won election for presidency, he ran home, burst into the house and said, "Mary, Mary, we have won." She's the one who brought political connections and capital to the marriage. She's the one who was sophisticated and introduced him to the political power centers. Without Mary Todd, there was no Lincoln. And, you know, who but Abe Lincoln could have worked with the jerks, which is a legal term, that he had as generals, right? Little Mac McClellan, who was famously disrespectful of Lincoln, who ignored him, who would have been fired by President Trump and any number of other presidents. Lincoln needed him to create the Army of the Potomac, so he put up with it. And he put up with it by doing the things we just talked about. That's different than love.
For sure. I mean, thanks a lot, Jonathan. That kind of answers one question I was going to ask, but I just wanted to repeat this to the audience because it's actually your question at the end of the chapter on collaboration. It's the question that you asked the reader to think about. I just want to kind of drop that here for people to think about before moving on. So at the end of each chapter, Jonathan kind of puts out a kind of question to think about and pause before moving on to the next chapter. And the one at the end of this chapter is, what was the best collaboration of your life? And then what made it enjoyable? What role did you play in it? And yeah, I think that's something for all of us to think about. Anyway, let me change tack a little bit because I mean, all of this is very serious. I mean, all this kind of love and collaboration and you know, the state of the world. But one of the things I really liked about reading the book is its lightness and its humor. So I think that was, you know, a service you did to the reader. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm grateful for that. But it's, you know, it's the kind of humor is important both to, I think, the tone of the book, but also to the content. And, you know, in fact, it's one of the early chapters is about humor and how Lincoln related to that. And you write a lot about what that did for Lincoln's personality and his kind of political career. And I mean, I'm basically in full agreement, but I want to push you a little bit in the other direction. I mean, I'm sure in life you've come across people who just really don't seem to have any sense of humor. But,
yes,
you know,
they tend to be federal judges.
Yeah, well, okay, well,
yes.
So,
yes.
so, I mean, I want to push you a bit in that direction, and I'm sure Lincoln met some of these characters too. I mean, if you really think about that set of characters, or that absence of the trait of, you know, a sense of humor, what do you think? What do you think people really miss out on? I mean, what's the core thing that people lose?
Well, you touched upon a important subject. Lincoln famously said, "If I didn't have my jokes, I could not live." Lincoln, who suffered from significant bouts of suicidal depression, was fully aware of the fact and discussed how humor was a lifesaver for him. And it's a lifesaver for me. I cannot imagine life without laughter. There is a reason I married a comedy writer. There's a reason why my wife's book, Stand Up, about stand-up comedy, where she interviewed George Carlin and Jerry Seinfeld and others. It is such an important document in our marriage. I am fully aware that the house of wisdom is full of woe and the house of mirth is full of folly. But I understand the book of Ecclesiastes to be suggesting that we find a balance. And that balance to me, and that balance for Lincoln was humor. I take a slight bit of exception with your notion, and I do in the book, that there are people born without a sense of humor. I refuse to believe. I refuse to believe it. Scientists, and I cite the study. They've identified in our limbic system and our dopamine uptake system what makes us laugh. We've evolved to have a sense of humor. We have evolved to have, as with a sense of smell or a sense of vision, a sense of the absurd. It's in our brains. We're hardwired for it. It can be developed like all our other senses if we're mindful and put some effort into it. And in the book, I try to give practical, concrete lessons on how to improve your sense of humor. Not because I want to turn you into a Borscht Belt comedian, although, Lucas, nothing would make me happier than to turn you into a Borscht Belt comedian, but because I think the sweetness and gifts of life belong to those who can laugh. And it's important, even if you don't believe that, if you want to be Lincoln as an advocate, if you want to be Lincoln as a storyteller, if you want to be Lincoln as a leader, if you want to be Lincoln as a great husband and father, learning how to develop and improve your sense of humor is fundamental. Laughter is the first step to being Lincoln. And, I also give exercises that you can practice to become funnier. If not yourself, then at least to appreciate laughter. Because I think it is extraordinarily important to understand love and laughter to be a fully engaged human being. And I will take one moment of personal privilege to say that one of the things I love best about the Rhodes Scholarships right now, today, is the Rhodes House commitment to addressing the entire scholar, including the soul of the scholar. I was fortunate enough to speak at the second retreat of the current Rhodes Scholars, where I talked about the importance of the issues that ultimately became this book. And I'm not saying Rhodes Scholars as a general group are not funny, but I am saying that there's a great deal about being successful academically and professionally that makes humor suspect.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, yeah, I think it's one of the remarkable things. I mean, just as someone who doesn't know very much about Lincoln, but I could pick up through the book, I think, a fairly remarkable fact that through his kind of political career, where he's going through many situations and many institutions that might cast a lot of doubt on humor, that it's really important to him to kind of drive through without letting that kind of get away from him. But then also, I guess once we start thinking about humor as not only an kind of inborn trait, but something that we can practice and actively tap into in how we relate to ourselves and other people in the world, I guess there's a question of where the balance is, and I had a moment of thought in one of the sections where you talk about don't overdo it, and you talk about how sometimes Lincoln himself would kind of take the rhetorical edge to a place where people around him were not really sure what what was going on anymore. And so this question of overdoing it, I mean, what I think you call it Lincoln's mania. Overdoing it, I mean, Lincoln can overdo it, a stand-up comedian can overdo it. I'm sure a lawyer could overdo it in court. In fact, I think you just volunteered moments in which you overdid it. I mean, in your life, whether as a lawyer or as a TV writer or producer, how have you kind of, I guess, reckoned with that limit of where the overdoing is?
Well, a couple things. I never actually made jokes in court.
Mm,
What's funny about what happened to me in court in my many trials, it was only funny in retrospect. I mean, I wish I could have said I was trying to be funny. I was held in contempt a number of times, and
mm,
one time after a very contentious hearing, I asked the judge, "Your Honor, just for the record, do you ever read my pleadings?" And that was not a good idea, but I wasn't trying to be funny. So you refer to Lincoln mania. That's actually what his contemporaries called it.
mm,
And, members of his cabinet, like Stanton, believed it was a sign of mental illness.
mm,
And, spare a moment to think about poor Billy Herndon, who had to sit in that one-room law office with Lincoln, who never stopped making jokes.
mm,
And there's nothing more annoying than someone who just keeps joking.
mm,
And I've been guilty of that, certainly. And there was a reason why my sport was boxing at Oxford, was because I used to get hit in the face a lot because I didn't know where that limit was.
mm,
Lincoln himself, and this is why I find him such a wonderful character, Lincoln himself wrestled with this his whole life. And I tell the story of the fact that, he was no saint. Lincoln could be incredibly sarcastic, cutting, and mean. He could be an insult comic. And the
mm,
most famous example of that, it was known as the skinning of Thomas, when Lincoln was a young politician and was in a debate with a guy named Thomas. And Lincoln literally made fun of the guy's voice and then mimicked his feminine walk.
mm,
And he was getting big laughs until Thomas broke down in tears and ran out of the room. And Lincoln was so appalled at what he had done, so ashamed, that he found Thomas and apologized. And to my knowledge, and to the historians I've read, he never used humor like a club like that again.
mm,
He was capable of it.
right.
And in the book, I compare our other great comic president, who also used humor to his greatest advantage, President Trump. And I point out the fact that President Trump, like President Lincoln, understood the power of humor to
Mm,
build community, to relate to people, and to make his points. The difference, of course, is President Trump is an insult comic.
mm,
His humor is always at the expense of someone else. President Lincoln's humor was always self-deprecating
mm,
and brought him down to people so that he could relate to them rather than putting others down. And it says something about our culture. It says something terrible about our culture that President Trump has been so successful with this kind of insult comedy.
mm,
I talk in the book that it's no mystery to me why the greatest leader of the last decade is a former stand-up comedian,
mm,
Zelensky in the Ukraine. Here's a man whose life was made as a comic, who has now proven himself to be Churchillian in his ability to lead his country. Comedy is one of the greatest tools of communication that exists in mankind. Who controls comedy controls the world is an interesting idea that Charlie Chaplin talked about, and it's what led him to make The Great Dictator.
mm,
Chaplin famously said to Alistair Cooke that if Hitler had had a sense of humor, the Germans would have won the war.
mm,
And so, along with love, I guess, if you're going to talk about Lincoln, you have to talk about laughter.
mm.
And so to introduce these concepts of love and laughter as serious subjects that we ought to embrace as scholars,
Mm.
you've identified as really the point of the book.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, so I just have one more follow-up on humor, and in fact, I have a lot of other questions too. But I just want to say that I mean we're just past the half-hour mark. So please please do think, those of you in the audience, about things you'd like to ask Jonathan or to throw into the mix. Because I mean, there are lots of questions I'd like to come back to, but I mean, I think it's a good time to open up to the floor after this one more follow-up, which is, so I would love for you to go a little bit more into this Lincoln-Trump comparison, Jonathan. I mean, if you don't mind, for, I think for those who haven't read the book, or even for those like myself who have, what would you say is your current, I mean, kind of sense of what was it in Lincoln's either personality or his life or his circumstances, environment, that kind of stopped him from kind of going down that road of the insult comic? Because I mean, the kind of the anecdote with Thomas kind of suggests that he had it in him. He could have
Absolutely
been that.
yes.
So I mean, what stopped him, or what would stop anyone from kind of, I guess, fully embracing that part of themselves?
It's a good question, and there were moments. Famously, Lincoln was told that a contingent of Union generals and their horses had been captured by the rebels, and Lincoln said, "I can make more generals. What makes me sad is losing the horses." And he caught himself. He had it in him. He was too good a trial lawyer. He was too sharp a cross-examiner to not have it in him. He controlled it. And I think he controlled it for pragmatic reasons, because he knew that hatred is a fuel that runs dirty and is not long lasting. I think love as his foundation. My father, who passed away last April, said to me for years, "A man may not remember what you say to him, but he'll always remember how you made him feel." And it took me a long time to understand that to make a joke at someone's expense is almost like violating the biblical prohibition against slander. It's to kill some part of that person's soul. What kept Lincoln from doing it ultimately, I think, was the pragmatic and also the personal, that a man with his sense of love and empathy just couldn't go down that path. And by the way, anyone who thinks that the comparison of Trump to Lincoln is fanciful or unfair, keep in mind, President Trump himself made the comparison. During his presidency, he compared himself to President Lincoln, and not shockingly felt that he measured up not only very well, but maybe slightly better than Lincoln. Now, I will always contend that America believes itself to be a classless, that is, we don't have classes in our country, and that it is a fundamental American myth that we embrace, that just because you're born rich doesn't mean you're entitled to anything. It is one of the great American myths that's a lie, of course, and President Trump proves it. Because he was born into the circumstances he was born into, because of the institutions that gave him access to, because of the privilege he was given, I believe President Trump believes he can use the club of mean humor as part of his entitlement. And I think the best antidote, the best way to stop it, is to remember my father's advice and think about the person that you're about to make the joke about. Think about that person as your son or your daughter. Do you really want to make that joke and get that laugh and cause that person the hurt? And frankly, I don't think that's ever occurred to President Trump.
Thanks for sharing that way of contrasting them. I mean, a lot of food for thought. But for now, I mean, I think let's open up for some questions from the floor. If I understand correctly, Georgie, please correct me. You can either raise your hand with the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, or you can pop a question, type a question into the Q&A kind of section. So feel free to do both. I see a number already in the Q&A. Maybe we could actually, since we're on this theme of humor, maybe we could start with the most recent question from Paul Dolan, which is, not having read the book, I wonder if you think Lincoln changed or even grew in relation to his conscious use of humor into the office of president.
Well, thank you, Paul Dolan. The answer to the question is he was a lifelong student of humor. Among the things that he read, other than military reports, were collections of jokes and stories. He bought all of them. His library contains a number of joke books, including joke books that were published during his presidency. I have one of them, actually, and my son has stolen it. God bless him. But it's old Abe's jokes and stories. And so he was constantly evolving as a storyteller and as a comic. And his humor became, as one would expect, deeper, richer, and more melancholic. The stories he told tended to be more and more about death, about mortality, about the cruelties of life. And I talk about the book. One could make an academic career, maybe I should have, just writing about Lincoln's stories about animals, like Aesop and Cervantes. You know, Lincoln saw the value in using animals as stand-ins for humanity. And his stories about animals became, I think, deeper. I think that, you know, it's one of the great cruelties of American history that this most sensitive and empathetic and loving of men became our bloodthirstiest and most brutal war president. And his humor reflected that crisis, I think. So it did. I think it did develop. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Let me pop in one of the questions in the Q&A, which was from earlier in our conversation about love. So Andrew Judge asks, it has been said that love is not a feeling, but an act of the will. Does this support your understanding of love?
Well, I am not embarrassed to occasionally quote myself because I can't be sued for the most part. I think that love is a verb. I don't think it's a noun, and it's a book. It's a point I make in the book. And in fact, the exercise at the end of the chapter on love, I write, love is an act and more than simply an idea. What is the most helpful and supportive thing you can do for the person you love most? Why aren't you doing it? I think love is a muscle that needs to be exercised. And one thing I noticed in my parents' marriage of 66 years was that my father was an active servant of his love for my mother. In that there was nothing he would do for himself before he made sure that it was done for mom. And you know, my mother was a bank teller for 41 years. Dad was a furniture salesman. Their expectations of what each person's career would be very different from my children's children. They're in their mid-20s. What their expectations of what their career and their partner's career will be. Nevertheless, there has to be a sense that my love will be made material through my service to the other. And I talk about the fact that I consider myself a feminist. My wife is certainly a feminist. I certainly changed diapers and did many, many more things than my father did in terms of the nuts and bolts. There were no nuts and bolts. They come up with a better term of actual child rearing. Lucas, you'll see this for yourself. I would be a liar if I said it was 50-50. It wasn't. My wife did more of it. And the greatest act of love I could show my wife when we were raising kids was to try to do as much for the kids as she did for the kids. So in answer to your question, Mr. Judge, I think love is, you know, faith without action is dead. Love without service is just an idea. And I think Lincoln is proof of that.
Thank you. That was, I mean, it's very beautifully said, Jonathan. And I think there's a question that actually connects the previous two questions in terms of humor and love. So this is a question from Betsy Borns. Do you think do
I
you
know her.
think do you think humor is proper, helpful in the face of death, especially that of a loved one?
Hmm. Now, just an interesting fact: the person who wrote that question, her full name is Betsy Borns Shapiro, but the Shapiro is silent. That is my beloved wife, and she's asked a pertinent question in our lives because in the past 18 months we've experienced the death of her father and of my father, and I also lost my mentor-in-law. And one of the characters I've written about in this book passed away 2 weeks after the book came out. My college roommate of 4 years unexpectedly dropped dead of a heart attack. My wife and I, therefore, had a very hard and sad year, and both our fathers did not have easy deaths. Nevertheless, we would shock ourselves by laughing. We found ourselves laughing at things that I would not have thought we would be capable of laughing in such dark times. And it saved us. And so, Lincoln suffered through the death of his child. He suffered an organic kind of series of depressions. Humor is what saved him. And if my wife didn't make me laugh as much as she makes me laugh, and if I didn't occasionally make her laugh, I don't know where we'd be. Certainly, I don't know where we'd be in this past year. So that's a good question, Ms. Borns. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Jonathan.
Yeah.
And I mean, thanks a lot for sharing in general with us today. There's one more question in the Q&A. Just again, heads up to everyone that we've still got some time. So if you'd like to pop more questions in Q&A or raise your hand, hopefully everyone can see that button. Please do. So a question from Jonathan Fulb. I mean, I think this is now broadening out to kind of Lincoln's role in world society. Is Lincoln a unifying figure in America today? How universally is he revered?
Interesting question. I was on a podcast that three fellas from South Carolina do about Hallmark Christmas movies. There's a channel in the United States called Hallmark that is created by the people who make the greeting cards, and it's become kind of a odd institution in the United States that they do these Christmas movies that are very popular, and they're popular on many levels. Some people think they're great Christmas movies. Most of us think they're just terrible movies made on the cheap in Canada and are sort of the source of great humor. Anyway, these guys have a whole podcast about it, but they had me on to talk about the Lincoln book. And I asked them, how was Lincoln taught in South Carolina? And one of these fellows is a teacher in high school. And he said, he's very controversial. People in South Carolina don't really necessarily all feel comfortable embracing Lincoln. Lincoln's birthday is a controversial holiday in South Carolina. Lincoln, as the murderous force that destroyed relatives, property, and culture in the South, is deemed by some a war criminal, high school kids. So the answer to the question is regionalism dead in the United States? And the answer is no. As Faulkner famously observed, we can't really talk about the Civil War because it's not over yet. And I think that people in the North, people in the West, people in the Midwest might be surprised by how divisive Lincoln remains. And I take that as a call to study Lincoln more and to try to understand Lincoln more. It wasn't why I wrote the book, but I'm glad I wrote the book. And I've been invited to go to Texas to talk about the book. My first book, I was asked to talk in I think all the southern states. I've not been asked to come down to talk about the book in any of those southern states now, and I have the same Speakers Bureau agent, and she's reached out to them, and there's just not the interest, which is interesting.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I've got on file here a couple of questions that were pre-submitted before the event today. And they are more about your career. And I'll just ask them together and kind of gather your thoughts on them. So one of them is, how do you stay relevant in today's world?
I didn't know I was relevant in today's world. This is fabulous. Stay relevant. Yeah, great.
I'm not sure if that's a compliment or putting you on the spot, but that's one of them. And then the other one,
Okay.
which I guess is, maybe you can take them together, is could you talk about how you became a writer and producer following a successful law career?
Well, those questions are related. I was in Berkeley Law Library one day, and I should mention I went to Berkeley Law School in large part because I wanted to be home in California, and partly because back then a semester of law school was $1,150, which I could make in a week at a law firm in the summer. The other reason I went to Berkeley Law School is it was pass fail. And after Harvard and Oxford, I decided I don't care about the grades. The guy who graduates last in his law school class is called lawyer. So let's just do that. And I got a job full-time working as a newspaper reporter in San Francisco. And so I did both. But I would go into the law library and there would be these shelves and floors of law reviews from all over the country. And they were dusty and nobody read them. And then I would write a newspaper article for the San Francisco newspaper I worked for, and I knew that at least 15,000 people that day read that story. And so it felt more relevant to me to be writing for a newspaper than trying to write a law review article, which is why I'm not at All Souls and Lucas is. So I guess I was just aware of the fact that if Marshall McLuhan is right, that the medium is the message that goes to the most number of people may have value and be more relevant. 11 million people used to watch The Practice, and we weren't considered a hit. Goliath, which I created with David Kelly, is a worldwide show. So I guess the answer to your question is, if you want to stay relevant, do something for screens rather than for some format. I have a play that I wrote called Sisters in Law. It's a two-hander about the relationship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor. We've had 7 productions of it, hundreds of performances. It's now in New York. And I took all the money that I earned from that play. I mean, all of it. I pooled all the money from all the productions and was able to buy an electric bike. I didn't have enough money for the helmet, and I didn't have enough money for the lock. So now you ask me, why did I become a writer producer? I will tell you why. Betsy Borns can confirm this. If Al Gore had won the presidency officially, the man that I had been the chief of staff for was going to be Secretary of the Interior, and I was going to be Undersecretary of the Interior. And he didn't win. And so at 32, I had to decide, was I going to go back to law or what? And my beloved wife, who had just given birth to our twins, Abraham and Sarah Shapiro, said, if you could get into the Writers Guild of America, we could get double health benefits, which is going to become very important, Lucas. This will be very relevant to you at some point. And so I have to say, for practical reasons, I did it. And also, I had been writing on the side my whole life and career, and I wanted to see if I could actually do it full time, seriously, as a professional. And I've been very fortunate. I can make the only boast in Hollywood that matters is that I have been employed continuously for 24 years.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. I mean, if I have cold sweats tonight thinking about my life choices, I'll blame you.
Well, then my
But-
work is done. It can't be a Rhodes Scholar event unless someone feels badly about themselves by the end. I'm usually the one. So yeah.
So let me just let me try to frame a question, kind of a final question to wrap things up. It's a combination of a question of my own and the final question in the Q&A. Let me I guess first ask my question, even though I think it's related. So towards the end of the book, I think this is in the conclusion, you sum up what the point of the book has been, and trying to kind of enable the reader to kind of find these steps to kind of better themselves in their lives. And you talk about success, and you say that part of the book has been about you alone have the power to determine what success means. I mean, either for yourself or thinking as a parent or thinking as a mentor, I guess I might just say that seems great, but I'm not sure what that necessarily means. And then so let me now link up with this question in the Q&A from Madhu Raghunath. So our current Western global ecosystem seems to define success fundamentally in terms of rapid financial gain and/or expressions of power and associated validation, including studying in Oxford or being a fellow of All Souls. Would you say this is simply mutually exclusive with the type of unconditional love that Lincoln advocates? Is dealing with this tension possible, and would you say it is a precondition to fighting the world's fight that roadies have, lest we forget, signed up for? Success, love, small questions.
Lucas, how good are you? How good are you to end with the greatest possible question, right? You're really good at this. So Lenny Shapiro didn't go to college. When he passed away, everyone said the same thing, which is he was the sweetest man any of us ever knew. He was kind, he was loving, and I was holding his hand when he passed. And among the last things he said was that he was the luckiest man he knew. And the truth is, my dad spent 4 years in the Air Force. Even though he never went to college, he tested off the charts for language ability somehow. And he was sent to Syracuse University, where he was taught Russian by Mensheviks, white Russian army generals who had worked with Kerensky. And within 9 months, my father, who jokingly said to the end of his life, he barely spoke English, was fluent enough in Russian to monitor Soviet air traffic during the Korean War off a secret listening post in the Bering Sea. So a very bright man. The day he was finished and he was trying to get home from this horrible island on the Bering Sea, he talked a pilot to let him on the manifest to get on the plane to go home. He got on the plane, he's sitting on the plane, a sergeant came and said, "We're overweight, Shapiro, you gotta go." Shapiro got off the plane, and that plane took off and crashed and killed everybody aboard. And in my family, Dad getting off the plane was our family motto, that without Dad getting off the plane, none of us were here. And the day he died, Dad was still talking about why was he so lucky. Well, my dad was a success. My dad was a lights out human success. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about credentials. He was very proud of his sons who became lawyers and the scholarship, and he would tell everybody about it. But my dad was the biggest success of anyone I know, because he passed away in peace, in love, and in the satisfaction of having lived the life of a mensch. Is that different than the Western values of rapid wealth and accumulation? Is that different than my younger self's desire for credentials, validation, to be the smartest guy in the room? Of course it is. And I think that the shock of recognition that I feel toward Lincoln is Lincoln seemed to understand that too, which is why I think John Wilkes Booth didn't take anything from Lincoln. Lincoln achieved success by being the man he was. And if you take nothing else from the book, the reason that I think you should try to be Lincoln is because Lincoln understood the success of the soul. And it's the soul, it's our soul, it's your soul, it's our collective soul that is the only legitimate and important standard. And I'll just conclude with this notion. I've talked about joking and laughing, and Lincoln certainly believed in those things. But I think if Lincoln were alive today, he'd remind us that most people's problem is we don't take our souls seriously enough. And I think that is the pathway to success. So.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. It's been an incredible hour. I've learned a lot, and I think I can speak on behalf of the audience too. And thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. For everyone, please remember that
thank you for doing this.
Book, How to Be Abe Lincoln, is coming to a bookstore near you, or in fact, coming to a link that's conveniently in the chat near you. Thank you so much again, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To the audience as well. And take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lucas.